I want you to imagine, just for a second, that it is the autumn of 216 BC. You are standing in the mud in southern Italy.
Yeah, and the situation is, well, it's apocalyptic.
Exactly. The Battle of Cannae has just ended, and the situation for the Roman Republic is just uh, beyond bad. Hannibal has just slaughtered 50,000 Roman legionaries in a single afternoon.
Which is just an unfathomable number. I mean, the historian Polybius later described these heaps of Roman dead as something totally unprecedented in human history.
Right, the volunteer army is essentially gone. Regional alliances are buckling. Rome is quite literally bleeding out.
It's the ultimate crater of catastrophe. And in that moment of absolute existential dread, the Rabbana Senate does something that provides the foundation for the entire framework we're going to explore today.
Yeah, they didn't offer a compensation package to new recruits.
No, they didn't hold a values workshop to boost morale.
They demanded the Sacramentum, an absolute, irreversible, binding military oath sworn by every single man who would bear arms.
Yep. And that specific historical moment is sending absolute shockwaves through modern culture right now.
It really is. But before we unpack why, I need you, our listener, to do me a quick favor. Hit those like and subscribe buttons. It is the single best way to support this deep dive and ensure we can keep bringing you these massive, comprehensive breakdowns.
We have a truly expansive journey ahead of us today. We're looking at a text that relies on a very intense, very radical reading of history to audit the modern world.
We really are. Today's mission is a comprehensive cover-to-cover review of a newly released, incredibly provocative ebook. It's called Roman Sacramentum, Soldier's Oath as Binding Identity by Conrad Riker.
And we really need to pitch this right up front because this book is currently catching fire across several specific online communities.
Oh, absolutely. Specifically the men's rights spaces and the red-pilled manosphere. Riker is offering what he frames as a ruthless audit of modern institutions. He's looking at the history of these institutions before what he argues is their complete capture by therapeutic, feminist, and Marxist ideologies.
And he provides this historical blueprint for reclaiming masculine identity.
Right. So if that premise grabs you, I highly recommend you pause. Head over to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books and grab a copy right now so you can follow along with us. You can also find the author directly and follow his ongoing cultural analysis on Substack at Conrad and Riker.
But because of the spaces this book is resonating in and the arguments it makes, we really need to establish our parameters for this discussion right out of the gate.
We do.
This material contains highly politically charged perspectives regarding gender dynamics, corporate culture, and the fundamental structure of the modern state.
Which means I need to be crystal clear with you, the listener. We are strictly here as impartial guides. We are not taking sides.
Exactly. We are neither endorsing nor condemning Conrad Riker's viewpoints.
Our role is to neutrally unpack the mechanics of his argument. We want to understand the fascinating historical frameworks, the philosophical logic, and the institutional critiques contained in the text.
We are exploring the map Riker has drawn without advocating for the destination.
Perfect. Okay, let's unpack this. The core premise of Riker's entire worldview begins with a concept he calls the invisible infrastructure.
Right. He builds this image of the modern man waking up before dawn, getting into a truck, and driving to a job that funds a government and a culture that he feels actively despises him.
The imagery is intentionally stark. Like he asks the reader to look at who is actually keeping the physical world functional.
Who is settling the levees? Who is deep sea welding?
Yeah, who is maintaining the high voltage power lines in freezing rain. He describes a demographic of men bearing the peril, laboring in the most dangerous, physically destructive roles, and financing the administration of society through taxes.
Yet, according to Riker's framework, this entire cultural machine declares their quiet stoicism not as a virtue, but as an admission of guilt.
He literally says these men are the invisible infrastructure holding up a world that would prefer them silent, docile, and eventually replaceable.
It is a staggering burden he's describing. I mean, they pay the taxes, they absorb the physical risks, and they take the blame.
While, in his view, the state and therapeutic institutions collect the credit, the spending power, and the moral authority.
Right. And what's fascinating here is how he explains this happens. Riker introduces a sociological concept known as the gamma bias.
Gamma bias. Yeah, this is crucial to his argument.
It is. Gamma bias is essentially the cognitive distortion where society tends to magnify gender differences when they flatter women and minimize or completely ignore those differences when they flatter men.
Or, conversely, magnifying male failures while minimizing female ones.
Exactly. Riker systematizes this to audit what he calls the architecture of male disposability.
Can you break down how he applies that specifically to disposability?
We'll think about how society reacts to tragedy. If a crisis disproportionately affects men, say, workplace fatalities, which are overwhelmingly male, or male suicide rates,
Right.
the cultural response is often to frame it as a byproduct of toxic masculinity, placing the blame back on men themselves. The empathy is gated.
Wow, gated empathy.
Yeah, and Riker argues this isn't accidental. He views it as a systematic inversion of natural hierarchy, achieved through the deliberate capture of language.
He spends a lot of time tracing this semantic shift of incredibly foundational words. The one that really stood out to me was father.
Oh, that chapter is intense.
It is. He points out that for millennia, the word father denoted a position of ultimate authority, respect, and structural necessity.
But today, he argues, family courts and cultural narratives have transitioned the concept of fatherhood into a baseline legal liability.
And a persistent moral accusation. He claims family courts treat male guilt as standard operating procedure.
And he extends this linguistic critique straight into the modern workplace, specifically dismantling therapeutic HR culture.
Yeah, Riker describes the corporate environment as a space engineered to pathologize natural male behavior.
Right, like if a man is naturally reserved and focused purely on the work, modern HR frameworks frame that as withdrawal.
Or lack of team cohesion, yeah.
Or if he demands empirical proof for a vague marketing claim, it's labeled antagonism. Directness is rebranded as hostility.
There is this incredibly vivid, almost darkly comedic example he gives of a guy sitting through a mandatory corporate HR module about toxic masculinity.
Oh, the consultant example.
Yes, and the irony Riker points out is that this module is being taught by a consultant who has never built a bridge, fixed an engine, or defended a perimeter in their life.
It's a striking image.
But, as I was reading this chapter, I found myself wondering, how does Riker differentiate between normal, healthy societal evolution, like genuinely trying to make workplaces less abrasive, and what he views as a targeted erasure of male agency?
That's a great question. His answer to that relies on the concept of reciprocity.
Reciprocity.
Right. Riker argues that organic, healthy societal evolution always maintains a balance between duty and authority. If you are the one expected to bear the risk, you inherently hold the authority to make the decisions.
Okay, that makes sense.
But what he diagnoses in the modern landscape is a complete decoupling of those two things. The therapeutic state demands the output, the physical provision, and the obedience of men, but has engineered 1,000 bureaucratic mechanisms to ensure those men deliver the output without receiving any corresponding authority or cultural respect.
He goes so far as to claim that the prevailing institutional view is that men possessing any remaining agency is the core problem to be solved.
Which raises the obvious question, how did this happen?
Right. He doesn't just point the finger outward at HR departments or family courts. He says men are complicit because they forgot a very specific ancient technology.
The technology of the oath, which pulls us right back to the mud of Cannae in 216 BC.
Right, the Sacramentum. We touched on the horror of that battle at the top of the show, but let's look at the mechanics of what the Roman Senate actually demanded of those survivors.
It wasn't a modern employment contract.
No. You couldn't negotiate your PTO. You couldn't weigh your options and jump ship to Carthage for a better benefits package next quarter.
It was absolute. And this is where Riker dives deep into the philosophy of identity, leaning heavily on Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics.
Yeah, to understand why the Sacramentum was so powerful, you really have to understand Aristotle's distinction between dynamis and energia.
Dynamis is raw potential. It's the capacity to do something, but without the act itself.
Like a block of marble has the dynamis to be a statue. A sword resting in a scabbard has the dynamis to cut.
But a sword actually swinging and splitting a shield that is energia. It is the active, realized fulfillment of a thing's purpose.
And Riker uses this ancient Greek framework to deliver a pretty blistering critique of how we view ourselves today. He argues that modern male identity is almost entirely trapped in dynamis.
Look at how we construct our professional and social lives today. Riker compares modern identity to a LinkedIn profile.
Oh, that's such a good analogy.
It is essentially a list of options, a gesture toward what someone might theoretically do if the algorithm favored them and they felt motivated on a Tuesday. It's purely self-description.
It makes me think of modern self-identity as an endless digital buffet. You scroll through, you try on a career for a few years, you adopt a personal brand.
You swap out your entire narrative when the dopamine of the previous one fades.
Exactly. It's provisional. You always keep a back door open.
Hmm.
But Riker contrasts that exhausting flexibility with a Roman soldier.
Right, when that man spoke the Sacramentum, Riker writes that he was chemically altered by the vow.
He ceased to be a farmer from the hills or a cobbler from the city. He was permanently transformed into a structural, load-bearing component of an empire.
Polybius, the Greek historian who chronicled Rome's rise, actually noted that Roman soldiers feared breaking this oath more than they feared death on the battlefield.
Wait, really? More than death?
Yeah. And that wasn't just because the legal penalty for desertion was brutal, it was an existential dread. The oath reorganized the man's atoms around a fixed point of duty.
Wow.
It dictated how he walked, how he spent his meager pay, how he treated the men to his left and right, and how he faced a charge.
Removing constraints is kind of the ultimate goal of modern society, right? We're constantly told that true freedom means having zero obligations you didn't choose this morning.
But Riker argues that this lack of constraint doesn't create freedom, it creates noise.
He has this incredible line. He says, "Modern men are weather." This book is about how to become stone.
He views the modern autonomy doctrine, the idea that you should constantly renegotiate your commitments based on your emotional state, as the fallacy of false liberation.
If a Roman legionary paused to renegotiate his oath or check in with his feelings before locking shields against a Germanic charge, he wouldn't be free.
No, he'd be dead and he'd get his brothers killed.
The unit collapses. So
Yep.
he establishes this incredibly rigid military history as the gold standard of male identity. But I have to ask, was this strict oath-bound hierarchy just for the military, or did it translate to the civilian world?
Because if this only works when people are swinging swords, it's just historical alarping, right?
Exactly.
Well, that is precisely why Riker shifts his focus from the blood of the battlefield to 1637 London. He introduces us to the ancient society of college youths.
The Guild of Bell Ringers at St. Paul's Cathedral. I found this part of the book absolutely fascinating.
We go from military slaughter to what sounds like a quaint church activity, but Riker uses them to explain the physics of what he calls predictable excellence.
Because when we think of church bells, we think of someone lightly pulling a rope. But change ringing in these massive English cathedrals is an entirely different beast.
Oh, completely. We are talking about 500-pound bronze bells mounted on massive wheels.
There are 8 ropes dropping down into the ringing chamber, and there's absolutely zero room for error.
Zero. If one guy loses his rhythm by half a second, you have multi-ton pieces of metal swinging out of phase.
The force of these bells colliding can literally crack the oak and iron frame of the tower itself, or the rope can snap back and shatter a ringer's skull.
It is a high-stakes physical environment that requires absolute hierarchical obedience to a master ringer.
And Riker uses this historical living geometry as the perfect foil to modern corporate management.
Right. The ringing of the bells requires strict mathematical methods, algorithms, with names like Plain Bob or Grandsire, that dictate exactly the sequence each bell must strike.
There is no room for a junior ringer to express his inner feelings or to pause the sequence to discuss the pacing. He must subordinate his individuality to the method.
Which leads to Riker's scathing audit of modern corporate buzzwords. He looks at concepts like agile teams, psychological safety, and consensus-based management.
He points to an HR department running trust falls and Myers-Briggs personality tests and says they are attempting to manufacture through therapy what the Romans and the medieval guilds achieved with a single, irreversible sworn oath.
He argues that flexibility in the modern corporate sense is a trap.
A trap.
Yeah, an absence of structure dressed up as a virtue. When an organization operates on consensus, Riker notes, it operates at the speed of its most anxious member.
And the Romans had a whole vocabulary for this institutional decay, didn't they?
They did. They called the breakdown of discipline pedia disciplinae. They diagnosed specific societal diseases.
Like militia.
Right, militia, which means softness or effeminacy of spirit.
Yeah.
And inconstantia, meaning instability or fickleness.
And otium, which is essentially idle, unproductive talk. Riker observes that modern management theory looks at these exact same diseases and rebrands them as best practices.
Yeah.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here on behalf of anyone working a modern job. Is consensus really always the enemy of execution?
Well,
Because we are all swinging 500-pound bronze bells or forming a shield wall. Most of the economy is knowledge work. You're coding software, you're designing a supply chain, you're coming up with a marketing campaign. Doesn't that require flexibility and a flattening of the hierarchy so good ideas can rise to the top.
Riker anticipates that exact pushback. He distinguishes heavily between environments that require high stakes execution and those that exist merely to generate conversation.
Okay, so he concedes the point a bit.
He concedes that if you are brainstorming an ad campaign, sure, sit in a circle and share feelings. But he points out that in any environment where failure means actual catastrophe, a surgical trauma team, a smoke jumper unit, a symphony orchestra playing Beethoven hierarchy and predictable excellence are the only operating systems that prevent disaster.
Right. The chief surgeon doesn't pause a triple bypass to poll the nurses on whether they feel validated by the angle of the incision.
Exactly. The conductor doesn't ask the violins if they agree with the tempo. Riker's overarching point is that we've taken the low-stakes, highly conversational model of a university faculty committee and applied it to everything, from manufacturing to civil engineering.
And by doing so, he claims we are destroying our capacity to actually build or execute at scale.
He cites Gallup's 2023 global workplace data showing that roughly 65% of workers are not engaged and 18% are actively disengaged.
Over 80% of the workforce is just checked out.
Riker says this isn't an engagement problem that can be fixed with free snacks in the break room. It's an ontological deficit.
These men have sworn no oath, they belong to no sworn brotherhood, so they are just acoustic static in the corporate machine. They have amplitude, but they lack frequency.
Beautifully put.
But if brotherhood, loyalty, and strict hierarchy are so historically effective at producing results and giving men a sense of structural identity, why are they vanishing from the modern workplace? Is it just incompetence?
Riker says it is absolutely not incompetence, it is a deliberate strategy.
And that brings us to his chapter on the weaponization of conflict of interest. I found this to be one of his most incisive institutional critiques.
It's a very compelling argument.
He argues that modern corporations actively, deliberately fracture male solidarity because they view it as a direct threat to bureaucratic control. He uses a hypothetical but incredibly realistic scenario to explain this. Let's walk through the Kowalski example.
Sure. So Kowalski is a mid-level manager with an open role on his engineering team. He knows a guy, a former Army captain he served 2 combat tours with.
They ran logistics convoys through ambush corridors in the Middle East.
Right. Kowalski knows this man's character down to his marrow. He knows his reliability, his ability to execute under extreme pressure, and his fundamental integrity. Naturally, he wants to hire him.
It makes perfect sense. You have a known, battle-tested quantity. But when Kowalski takes this to HR, they block the hire. And what is the reason they give? Conflict of interest.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where Riker deploys what he calls the grammarian's scalpel. He traces the semantic drift of that exact phrase, conflict of interest.
I love when authors do this, tracking how a single phrase gets hijacked over time. Historically, conflict of interest meant something very specific in fiduciary law.
Exactly. It meant a judge quietly owning stock in a company he's currently presiding over, or a government procurement officer taking a cash kickback to award a contract.
It was a measurable financial conflict between your legal duty of impartiality and your private wallet.
But Riker points out that over the last 40 years, the definition has metastasized. It drifted from self-enrichment at the expense of a beneficiary to having any personal relationship that might influence a hiring decision.
The modern therapeutic bureaucracy now treats friendship, shared history, and loyalty themselves as deeply suspicious elements.
And here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Riker argues that the HR department doesn't actually fear that Kowalski's army buddy is going to be bad at the job. They don't fear bad judgment. They fear competing loyalty.
Wow, competing loyalty.
If Kowalski hires the man he went to war with, he creates a bond inside the corporate architecture that predates the company and will outlast it.
That buddy owes his ultimate loyalty to Kowalski, not to the chief diversity officer or the VP of human resources.
Together, they become a power block. And to a sprawling bureaucracy, a power block of sworn friends who will cover for each other, speak plainly, and challenge nonsensical orders is an existential threat.
When I read that, it instantly reminded me of how medieval kings consolidated power. A medieval monarch would explicitly outlaw local feudal lords from raising their own private armies.
Right, because the king needed all loyalty and all force to flow strictly upward to the crown.
If a local lord has a private network of loyalty, he isn't completely dependent on the king's goodwill. He has leverage.
Riker uses very similar historical contrasts to highlight this dynamic. He points out that the Roman legions practically required men to fight alongside their brothers and cousins because blood ties prevented routing.
The medieval guilds required master craftsmen to apprentice their own sons.
The House of Medici didn't build a trans-European banking empire by posting job openings on a Renaissance version of LinkedIn to avoid the appearance of favoritism. They hired cousins, nephews, and sworn allies.
Because in a harsh world, the network of trust was the institution. You didn't trust the paperwork, you trusted the man.
But today, Riker notes, the corporate state enforces an entirely inverted morality. It assumes that loyalty to a faceless, profit-driven corporation is virtuous, but loyalty to a lifelong friend is somehow corrupting.
It deliberately isolates the man so he's interchangeable, atomized, and entirely dependent on his bi-weekly salary.
Riker warns his readers that a man standing alone inside a modern corporation is a man on a kill list. He just doesn't know the date of his execution yet.
The only defense, according to this book, is to build an informal alliance, a shadow network of trusted men operating quietly beneath the corporate radar.
But the system doesn't just control men externally through HR policies and family courts. Riker makes a very uncomfortable pivot here.
He does. He argues the system actually controls men internally through comfort.
This is a brutal chapter. It is an audit of internal biological warfare. Riker argues that the modern man hasn't just had this ancient covenant of booty stolen from him, he has actively, willingly traded it for a cheap subscription to physical comfort.
The statistics he pulls to back this up are grim. He cites the CDC reporting a 38% male obesity rate in the United States.
He points to studies showing average male testosterone levels dropping by roughly 1% per year since the 1980s.
And he highlights data showing millions of adult males averaging over an hour of high-speed pornography consumption every single day.
Riker refuses to view these as separate public health anomalies or harmless lifestyle trends. He views them as visible symptoms of a systematic surrender.
It is the male will capitulating to the stomach and the groin. He argues that a therapeutic, consumer-driven economy profits immensely from this exact surrender.
Because a man who cannot control his impulses is a perfect consumer.
He brings in some heavy historical artillery to frame this. Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
Yes. Gibbon identified what he called injurious luxury as the corrosive agent that ultimately dissolved the Roman military spirit.
And Riker pairs that with the 4th century Roman military historian Vegetius, who famously complained that new recruits to the legions had grown so soft from city living that they petitioned the emperor to let them stop wearing their heavy armor.
They could no longer march 20 miles under the weight of iron. The empire lost the ability to conquer its own internal appetites long before the barbarian coalitions crossed the Rhine.
He also draws a direct parallel to Weimar Germany in the 1920s. He paints this picture of Berlin drowning in avant-garde cabarets, cocaine, and a massive explosion of pornography, all while the political class debated parliamentary procedure.
Riker's political physics here is terrifyingly simple, but hard to argue with historically. The man who cannot refuse his own belly will ultimately accept the terms of any conqueror. Tyranny advances through the gap that appetite has already opened.
But again, reading this, I have to push back on Riker's framework. Doesn't this sound like punishing almost puritanical asceticism?
Well, I think
Is there no room in this blueprint for a guy to just rest on a Sunday afternoon, watch a football game, have a beer, or enjoy his life? Does everything have to be this relentless, white-knuckle, Spartan discipline every second of the day?
Riker explicitly addresses this, and it's a crucial distinction. He says appetite itself isn't evil. Hunger, sexual desire, the need for rest, these are natural goods. They drive human continuation.
Okay, so he's not saying you can never eat a burger.
No, not at all. His issue is when appetite becomes ungoverned by oath, by reason, or by hierarchy. When a man is chosen for by whatever digital stimulus or biological urge is loudest and most immediate, he is no longer a free agent.
He is simply a biological machine responding to marketing inputs. He calls it livestock management with better marketing.
Exactly. And the antidote he prescribes is understanding what genuine liberty actually is. According to Riker, liberty is not the ability to do whatever you want. Liberty is the power to refuse.
It's the capacity to subordinate a screaming impulse to a higher reasoned purpose.
He advocates for small daily refusals as absolute logistical necessities. Skipping refined sugar, throwing your phone in a drawer after dark, fasting 1 day a week. He calls this soul training.
It's building reps.
Precisely. It builds the neural pathways of discipline in low-stakes moments so that when a real crisis hits, When you are threatened with firing for refusing an unethical order or when your family is in danger, the nervous system is already capable of holding the line.
Riker writes that the oath against appetite isn't sworn in some grand public ceremony. It's sworn in the dark at 5:30 a.m. when the alarm goes off and the body screams for sleep, but the will dictates that you stand up.
So, assuming a reader actually follows this blueprint, he masters his internal appetites, he finds like minded men, and forms this local high trust brotherhood we've been talking about.
Right.
How does that brotherhood actually function in the real world? Specifically, how do they handle disputes in a society where, as Riker argues, the state is openly hostile to them?
That brings us to the final and frankly most radical structural proposal in the entire book, the father court and guerrilla asymmetry.
Let's start with his critique of the current system. Riker views the modern family court and civil litigation system as a machine designed from the ground up to process men as criminals by default.
He points out the sheer volume of men who lose their properties, their access to their offspring, and their societal standing through legal processes that assume male guilt and female victimhood.
His solution is a complete withdrawal from that system wherever legally possible, replacing it with what he calls the father court.
The father court.
This is a return to a private, sworn tribunal of local men. It's a mechanism for a functioning male order to operate as a shadow infrastructure, doing what he claims the bureaucratic state is fundamentally incapable of doing.
Judging with intimate knowledge, enforcing with real accountability, and correcting with precision rather than destruction.
He gives a very specific, concrete example of how this works in practice, and I think it's worth walking the listener through it.
Let's do it. So let's say Brother A loans Brother B $6,000 to buy equipment for a new landscaping business. 6 months later, the business completely fails.
Brother A wants his money back. Brother B says he's dead broke, the money is gone, and Brother A knew the risks of a business loan.
If these two men take this dispute to a state civil court, what happens?
The state applies rigid contract law. It issues a judgment that Brother B mathematically cannot satisfy.
Both men end up paying exorbitant legal fees that eat up half the disputed amount, no one gets made whole, and they leave the courthouse as bitter, lifelong enemies. The community is fractured.
But in Riker's framework of the father court, the elders of this sworn brotherhood hear the case. The crucial difference is they actually know these two men.
They have local knowledge.
Exactly. They know if Brother B squandered that $6,000 on a new truck he couldn't afford and stopped answering his phone, or if he worked grueling 60-hour weeks and just got wiped out by a bad hailstorm and terrible luck.
Because they have that longitudinal knowledge of character, they can tailor a verdict designed to restore actual peace and balance, rather than just extracting a financial penalty.
They might order Brother B to repay the debt in sweat equity, say, repairing the roof of Brother A's mother's house over the next 6 weekends, and doing the landscaping for Brother A's property for a year.
No one goes bankrupt. No one gets their life destroyed by state garnishments. The men are physically working together to mend the breach.
And the enforcement mechanism is entirely based on honor and social consequence. If a man defies the ruling of the father court, he isn't sent to jail. He is simply named an oath breaker and expelled from the network.
He loses access to the mutual aid, the emergency fund, and the brotherhood.
And as Riker points out, in a high-trust community operating in a low-trust world, that loss of respect and protection is far more devastating than a probation officer's fine.
It's a fascinating model of parallel infrastructure. But, it raises a very pragmatic question, which Riker spends the final chapters addressing. You can't adjudicate everything in a father court.
Right. This raises an important question. How does this sworn, disciplined man navigate the modern institutions he cannot avoid? He still has to interact with the corporate HR tribunals, the university Title IX offices, the state equity audits.
Right, because you can't always just retreat to your local brotherhood in the woods. Sometimes HR pulls you into a fluorescent lit conference room.
And here, Riker pulls heavily from military strategists like Sun Tzu and Mao Zedong to explain the concept of guerrilla asymmetry.
He notes that a guerrilla fighter understands his material disadvantage. He does not try to hold open territory, and he never fights a set-piece battle against a conventional army on their terms.
He chooses the time, the place, and the angle of engagement. Riker argues that a man who tries to fight a modern HR department on their terrain, filling out their grievance forms, citing their corporate policies, and appealing to their sense of fairness, is marching blindfolded into a prepared ambush.
He compares it to a Roman legionary, finding himself encircled by hostile tribes in the Teutoburg forest. The legionary didn't pause to file a formal grievance with the Germanic chieftains demanding a more equitable battlefield.
He tightened his armor, conserved his energy, and looked for a structural weakness in the enemy line.
Riker says the modern bureaucracy doesn't actually want to debate with you. It wants your compliance, your signature, and your eventual silence.
Therefore, the asymmetric response he prescribes is to completely withdraw intellectual approval. Do not complain.
Riker is incredibly strict about this point. He writes that complaining is a biological urge that just bleeds energy.
The therapeutic system is explicitly built to process, absorb, and ultimately punish male rage and theatrical defiance. Getting angry in an HR meeting just gives them the exact data points they need to justify your termination for hostility.
So instead of fighting loud, he says you have to fight smart. You have to learn their unwritten rules.
He posits that every modern bureaucracy has two manuals. There is the glossy one they publish in the lobby and on the corporate website about fairness, equity, and inclusion.
And then there is the actual hidden operating manual that dictates how power is truly wielded and who is protected.
His advice is to learn the second manual flawlessly. Maintain absolute stoicism. Wait for the precise, calculated moment when a single, well-placed, meticulously documented question posed mildly in an email does more institutional damage than 1,000 vocal complaints in a meeting.
It's a strategy of exploiting the massive gap between what an institution publicly claims to believe and what it actually enforces behind closed doors. And Riker points out a glaring paradox at the heart of all this.
Which is?
These massive, overtly hostile systems rely entirely on the voluntary compliance and the inherited capital of the very men they claim to disguise.
Yes. That concept of inherited capital is where he brings his entire argument to a head.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today. We've covered the devastation of K'nai, the physics of medieval bell ringers, the modern weaponization of HR policies, the chemical rot of giving in to our appetites, and the asymmetric guerrilla tactics of the Father Chord.
We really ran the gamut.
But I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. So, what does this all mean? Something that builds on everything Conrad Riker has argued, but takes it one step further into the future.
It is the ultimate logical conclusion of his thesis.
If the modern bureaucratic grid, and I mean the physical roads, the high-voltage power plants, the global supply chains, and the physical enforcement of law, is truly running on the inherited capital of men's labor, what happens to the physical and social infrastructure of our cities when the last generation of oath-bound men ages out?
When there is no one left who knows how to hold the line.
When the men who kept the water running and the power on have either been softened by therapeutic culture, isolated by HR policies, or simply decided to walk away to build their own parallel structures, does the grid just fail?
It's a sobering thought experiment. When the men who maintain the physical world are told for decades that their very existence, their directness, and their masculinity is a toxic problem, eventually they believe it, or they are silenced, or they just quietly quit.
And when that happens, the physical grid doesn't argue with HR. It doesn't write a think piece. It just stops working.
That structural collapse is the reality Riker is trying to prepare his readers for, and that is exactly why Roman Sacramentum, soldier's oath, as binding identity, is such a lightning rod of a book right now.
Whether you are deeply embedded in the manosphere and see this as a survival guide, or you are just trying to understand the historical mechanics of how institutions actually function once you strip away the public relations language, you cannot ignore the framework he is laying out.
The historical context alone connecting ancient Rome to modern corporate dysfunction is an incredible exercise in seeing the long game of human civilization.
Absolutely. So to you, the listener, head over to Amazon Kindle or Google Playbooks right now. Buy Roman Sacramentum. It is a must-read if you want to understand this massive cultural shift happening beneath the surface, especially before these ideas become entirely mainstream.
And be sure to follow Conrad Riker directly for his ongoing, unfiltered analysis at Conrad and Riker on Substack.
It is a text that will fundamentally change how you view your daily interactions. Truly. And before you go, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the show. It is the best way to support us and ensure we can keep doing this. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today, and we will see you on the next one.